Hey everybody, it's Anna and welcome back to my booktube channel. Today is going to be my final summer reading wrap-up / check-in because I think now with the beginning of back to school season upon us, and at least where I live, leaves starting to change colors and fall off trees already, this is going to be the last of my quote-unquote summer reading updates. So we've got a few things to share with you today. I read in this period since my last wrap-up, looking at my notes, 2 novellas, 1 short story collection, 1 novel, 1 nonfiction, and 2 nonfiction anthologies. So might seem like a lot, but a decent number of these were pretty short, or I was reading them 1 chapter or essay at a time over the course of a month and a half, and I just so happened to wrap a lot of them up at the same time. So let's do the novellas first, because I don't actually have to hold them up. I have a little note card on which I wrote my stuff. That was What Moves the Dead and What Feasts at Night, which are 2 novellas by T. Kingfisher. I have never read anything by T. Kingfisher before, but I really liked the sort of fungal horror of these novellas. I thought the first one was pretty good. Like, it was a retelling of Fall of the House of Usher, the Edgar Allan Poe short story, with a side of Beatrix Potter's eccentric fictional aunt who studies mushrooms, and there is a sort of, like, by our reckoning, like, trans or gender non-conforming sworn soldier who is the protagonist, and is kind of the person that pulls on some of those loose threads that Poe leaves in the original, so to speak. I didn't care for the second one as much, What Feasts at Night. That seemed to be more of a retelling of perhaps a Balkan folklore story that I wasn't really familiar with, but I just don't think that the story, the plotting of it, was as compelling, and it was nice to see those characters recur, but there really just wasn't much in terms of their growth. So that was fine. But the 3rd novella in that series, the Sworn Soldier series, is coming out on September 30th. It's called What Stalks the Deep, and I already have it on hold at the library. So I liked it enough to continue on with reading the series. All right, let's do our novel next. The novel that I read is The Safekeep by Yael van der Voden. This just recently won the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I have a whole spoilery review of this book that will have gone live before you see this wrap-up video. So if you're interested in a spoilery discussion of that, please head on over to that video. I won't be spoiling the book here, but this is a book that is about Isabel. She is a queer Dutch woman living in the Netherlands in the 60s after the war, and she begins to come out of sort of her uptight sexual repression as she's falling for Ava, her younger brother's girlfriend. She and Ava wind up spending a decent amount of time together in Isabel's old family home, like childhood home that she grew up in during the war years. And in addition to this being very messy in terms of their relationships and clashing personalities, it's further complicated by a startling discovery that Isabel makes about Ava's past and who she truly is. I won't say any more about it because I think that's like a huge part of the experience of reading this book, but this was incredible. Definitely recommend it very highly. And then let's do the short story collection. This is another author that's very prolific but new to me. I read Sir Hereward and Mr. Fitz, Stories of the Witch Knight and the Puppet Sorcerer by Garth Nix. This was a book that I read for a genre fiction book club that I'm in, and I know that Garth Nix is an amazing fantasy author. Haven't read any of his stuff before, but it turns out that I have actually read a couple of these short stories, some that were anthologized in the Rogues anthology by George R.R. Martin, edited by George R.R. Martin and Gardner Dozois, and The Book of Swords, which was also edited by Gardner Dozois, R.I.P. This was an interesting collection. I don't know how representative it is of Nix's overall work, because these are just sort of one-shot stories about Sir Hereward, who is sort of a magical sorceress rifleman, and Mr. Fitz, who is an animated sentient puppet sorcerer, and the two of them go around and basically try to protect the world from these out-of-control godlets, which are just range in ridiculousness from hungry dragons to Cthulhu-like eldritch monsters, and it is very much about like the banter and the relationship between the two of them. Mr. Fitz started out as Sir Hereward's nanny, so they have been together for a long time. There's a lot of history there. And I think overall I liked this book. I still think the first story in the book was my favorite. It reminded me a lot of the sort of picaresque back and forth between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, and in fact, Garth Nix actually credits that as one of his inspirations for these two characters. So, I don't know, like, I think that if you like reading fantasy short stories, you might enjoy this. I don't know, like, again, how representative it is of Garth Nix's works overall. So, take that with what you will, but I liked it, and I have some fun things to share with the book club when I have my discussion with them later today. All right, let us continue on with my nonfiction read. This was Pink-Pilled Women in the Far Right by Lois Shearing. This was a book that was Hannah Witten's Patreon book club pick earlier this year, and I didn't have a copy of it at the time, but I finally got it, and this is kind of the first of its kind book published, I believe this is by, Manchester University Press. It's a first of its kind book studying the roles that women play in far-right movements, mostly focusing on like the rise of the modern day far right, but it does go back a little bit towards the history of things like the Klan in the United States or the fascist movements across the world in the 1930s. Kind of how women play this indispensable role in organizing and doing the reproductive labor of far-right movements, even as the rhetoric of far-right movements would seem to be nothing but demeaning and belittling and pushing them out of those spaces. So this is kind of a book about why women join up with these movements in the first place, what do they get out of it, and how do they leave. This was very well written. I think that my biggest takeaway from this is that we absolutely need more research into this. There is a lot of research and writing done about men and young boys and how they become radicalized to join the far right. And it's a completely different story for women, but it is nonetheless really, I think, a key piece in understanding how we got to the point where we are. This specifically also kind of analyzes how the sort of MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, the wellness and health lifestyle influencers that spread medical misinformation, and the TERF or trans... Sorry about that, my camera died, so let's try and pick up where we left off. I think the last thing that I was saying was that this also kind of does an investigation of the TERF movement, particularly in the UK, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, and how that can also be a part of the pipeline by which women get involved in the alt-right. So yeah, like I said, my biggest takeaway from this is that we need more research and we need more writing on this. I also think that this book would be an excellent companion read to Black Pilled by Elle Reeve, which was one of my books that stuck with me from the first half of this year. So if you read that, or if you're interested in the topic at all and you want to learn more, please do check this out. Alrighty, so this book, The Lives of a Cell, Notes of a Biology Watcher by Lewis Thomas, was kind of an impulse purchase at a used bookstore when my husband and I were down in the DC area recently, and we have a couple different bookstores that we like to go to down there that we frequent. And I was kind of just going through the science and nature section looking for a few different titles, and this one caught my eye. It wasn't on my list, but basically what this is an anthology of essays that the author wrote for the New England Journal of Medicine, and this was published in the 1970s. I was kind of intrigued by the premise of this, although unfortunately, like a lot of anthologies, it can be a little bit hit or miss, like how good each individual essay really is. And I don't know, I feel like these might have been more meaningful if I had had more of the context in which he was writing some of this stuff in the 70s. I was really interested by the author's essays on theories of like the psychology of humans as social animals, social insect dynamics, and just the way that he has of like looking at the earth almost as like a large cell or each of our individual cells as being made up of different organisms. I think this had a lot in common with some of the Gaia theory, which is that like the Earth itself, like the planet, is its own organism, and that is something that I have done a little bit of reading about as well. But overall, honestly, like I felt that so many of these essays were really too short for me to get particularly invested in the writing or the ideas behind them. And that's kind of just the nature of it. You know, these were short essays that were written for NEJM. So I think, you know, if the topics are interesting, check it out, but it wasn't necessarily something that I'm like rushing out to recommend. Okay, and then finally, this is a book I have talked about a little bit on this channel because I started reading it back in June. I read one of the essays in it for the Queer Lit Readathon for Pride Month, and that is An American Girl Anthology, Finding Ourselves in the Pleasant Company Universe. This is an anthology published by the University Press of Mississippi. They have a Cultures of Childhood series that I'm really interested to check out more of, and is edited by Justine Orlovsky-Schnitzler and Casey Highsmith. I talked about this a little bit before, but in case you didn't watch this video, this is an anthology of essays written about the American Girl dolls. This was a company that was created to basically make these educational dolls that had accompanying historical fiction books that were marketed towards young children, with the idea being that through sort of play and reading stories about girls like themselves, young girls would be more interested in like learning about American history. And I had one of these dolls growing up that was a gift from my grandparents. Felicity, who is definitely a lot of her sort of baggage as a character is examined here because, her family owned slaves, which is a thing that is not really examined in the books. It's there, but do we talk about this or interrogate it in any way? No, we do not. But as somebody that really loved reading these books, and I am one of the like stereotypical people who got very into learning about history, and I've, published games that I've designed about American history. I did my undergrad and like my grad fellowship in American literature. I can trace a lot of that interest and that passion, particularly with the like colonial and American Revolution era, back to being exposed to this as a child. So this takes a look not just at the material culture of the dolls themselves and just kind of analyzing like what the books mean, but it also kind of offers a space for imagined possibilities. Specifically, the section Who Gets to Be an American Girl I really liked, and I will just read you the titles of some of these essays because I think this section was really my favorite about the book. So we have Where is My Disability Community? A comparative close reading of children's historical fiction by Marissa J. Spear, talking about disability such as it is and such as it exists in the American Girl dolls and books. How the Irish Doll Became White, the Nellie O'Malley AG story arc by Mary M. Burke. This was a really interesting story about Nellie, who is a best friend character who got her own doll from the like Samantha book series. It's like a Victorian series. And how there is this overarching discussion of how Irish immigrants to the United States were not considered white and then became white over time, and yet there is still a lot of this like racialized coding and othering that went into the production of this doll. Specifically, and I didn't know this because, how would I have known this as a kid, but that for the Nellie doll, the company used the same facial mold as they used for Josefina, who is a Latina doll from like the early 19th century. So just kind of interesting the ways in which the company equates race kind of across what we think of as different racial groups, at least as far as this doll is concerned. So read the essay if you want to read more about that. Belonging and Indigeneity in the American Girl Universe by Sheena Roteman Wynn. This was an excellent essay about Kaya, who is the indigenous doll who kind of occupies a peculiar place because she is still listed as an American girl, but she is part of a pre-colonial contact civilization of the Namipu in the Pacific Northwest. What does it mean to market and sell this doll as an American girl when she does not even have a concept of what America is? We have Ivy Ling, Corinne Tan, and Chinese American Misrepresentation in American Girl by Mackenzie Kwok. This was a lot of new information for me, particularly surrounding the fact that the company has never made an Asian American or like of Asian descent historical character doll. They've done a couple of the like modern day ones, but this was kind of about like Asian American identity and how it is or isn't represented in the books. And then Caught Between Jewish and American, Rebecca Rubin and the Americanization of the Jewish Immigrant Experience by Samantha Paquette. This had a lot of overlap with the essay about Nellie in terms of the ideas of who gets to count as white, and do they count as white when they first immigrate to the United States, or is that only after a process of assimilation and frequently, as it is in like the case of the Irish, kind of adopting a lot of the trappings and tenets of white supremacy, namely policing Black people and just having this sense of, policing a racial hierarchy in order to be able to gain acceptance in white American society. So I really liked this book. What was the other one I really liked? Where is it? The other essay that was a real standout for me was The Care and Keeping of Me, A Moment, a Year, a Book, and Returning Home to Our Changing Bodies Again and Again by Hannah Matthews. So American Girl, the company, when I was a kid, and I think they still do publish this, they've just split it into 2 different books instead of 1 book, published this sort of like best-selling, over 1 million copies sold, sort of like Girl's Guide to Puberty and Changing Bodies and stuff like that. And that was the book that I had as a kid, and that was also kind of the sex ed that I had as a kid, because that was not something that I got in school, nor was it something we really talked about, at home. That was just not something that we did. And so I know that it isn't just me, but a lot of people have sort of nostalgia for that book and what it taught us, even as we may have grown up and seen the limitations of that book, particularly with regards to actually talking about gender and sexuality in a meaningful way, or the way in which the book kind of presumes that you will have a certain level of privilege throughout your childhood. That there are going to be certain negative experiences that you will not have experienced, because the book doesn't really go into them. That one was written so well, and just the language throughout the essay was incredible. So again, I think this is a great book for anyone who is interested in sort of the property, the company, the American Girls. If you played with them, if you read the books, if you just, follow the American Girl meme accounts on social media, you might get something out of this. But I think also if you're interested in things like the study of childhood, the study of like the material cultures of childhood, kind of as the series is titled, that you could get something good out of this book. So that is going to do it for my final summer reading wrap-up of 2025. I can hardly believe that the time has gone by this quickly. I'm also just like having my mind blown that I am now 5 months pregnant, and I somehow managed to make it through the summer, the heat, the awfulness, without completely like melting. So that's very exciting. I expect that probably right up until I have the baby, my reading is going to continue apace, but I will check back in when we get a little bit closer to that time, because I will probably be taking not just some time off from YouTube, but to be perfectly honest, taking time off from reading, because that's going to basically be my whole focus, is welcoming the baby and, getting ready to have this new addition to our family. But until then, I am definitely continuing on with all of my reading plans. I think I'll be making a video pretty soon about participating in Shake-Tember, which is a Shakespeare reading event on BookTube that I participated in like way back in the day, pre-pandemic. It's been going since pre-pandemic. I just don't think I've participated in it since then. And other than that, I don't really think I have any sort of fall reading plans in the same way. Summer Book Bingo was really fun. I'm glad I did it. I did not get a blackout on my board, but I did finish a couple rows and columns, which felt very satisfying. So yeah, let me know what you've been reading and enjoying, or reading and despising, as the case might be, in the comments down below. I hope that your summer reading was a lot of fun and excellent, and I just want to say thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!